staying with us, Wits School of Public Health, on occupational therapist and bio-ethicist Dr. Lee Randall, I hope I pronounced that correctly, decided to take a closer look recently at minibus taxis in Johannesburg and find out what's really responsible for them. Randall found that taxi drivers work at least 6 days a week, 15 hours a day, so in some cases no UIF or overtime, and they have to pay for their own petrol, professional driving permits, licenses, taxi cleaning and minor repairs. From realities, they generate very low income, like wages as little as 200 Rand a week, plus any leftover fares on good days. The findings of Randall's research have been highlighted during the 6th UN Global Road Safety Week, which took place from the 17th to the 23rd of May this year. To unpack this research then, we're joined by Dr. Lee herself. Doctor, very good evening to you. Welcome to News at Prime. So, just reading some of your findings, it sounds very much like an industry built on the exploitation of its workers.
Well, yes, one can look at it that way. Perhaps I can just give a little bit of background. As an occupational therapist, I have assessed many crash survivors from taxi crashes, or should I say crashes including taxis, because other vehicles are often involved as well. Some of them have been drivers, some have been passengers, and some of the people I've assessed have been other kinds of road users. So I became curious about the fact that the drivers get so strongly blamed for crashes, with often a lack of understanding of their work conditions. And as an occupational therapist, I wanted to better understand the conditions under which they work. So you've mentioned some of my key findings, but I'd like to touch briefly on 3 key findings, and then also come up to date by talking a little bit about COVID risks and minibus taxi drivers. So you've mentioned the long hours, and yes, that was an absolutely key finding, that on average they are working around 15 hours a day. All of them reported being on the road by 6 in the morning, all of them reported still being on the road 6 in the evening, and some only knocked off at 9. And as you said already, they're working most days of the week. One of the interviewees in my study said, "I long for a day when the taxi breaks down because then I can have a day off." And that kind of sums it up. The sectoral determination for the taxi sector, which came into place in 2005, actually only allows for an 8-hour shift or at most 4 hours of overtime, so up to a 12-hour shift. Those 4 hours must then be paid at 1.5 times the normal rate, and any driving that is done after 8 p.m. or before 5 a.m. is considered night shift driving, and they should receive a night shift allowance. Now, the fact of the matter is that their employment is highly precarious, and that brings me on to my second major finding, which was that they're substantially underpaid in relation to what they should receive and in relation to the kind of work that they do. And I think this is a fact that the public is not always aware of. I think there's a perception that they have loads of cash and they're actually making a decent living. But they're in fact not. They have to pay for the most part, a due or a target over to the taxi owner for every driving day. Now, it's difficult to get a handle on exactly how much this involves, but on average, the study participants reported about 700 Rands a day. Obviously more for very busy routes and bigger vehicles, and less for quieter routes and smaller vehicles. From the moment they start driving, they are stressing about raising enough by bringing in enough fares to cover that owner's due. They also, as you mentioned, have to cover petrol, taxi washing, some minor repairs, and also things like traffic fines. As we know, there are some bribes that get paid, and the taxi associations may even ask the drivers to give cash donations, for instance, for funerals when a taxi owner or a driver has been killed, which happens regularly. So all in all, they are very stressed about money, and the key theme that emerged from my interviews was it's all about the money. They are chasing money from morning till night, and they are still coming away with less than the sectoral determination requires them to be paid. And then the third key finding, and I think this is a very important one, is that the majority of the study participants reported driving elderly vehicles, 8 years old and older. About a quarter reported that the vehicles they drove were older than 11 years. Now, that mightn't sound so bad, But the Department of Transport itself says the reasonable operating lifespan for a minibus is 7 years. And apart from the age of the vehicles, the drivers in general reported some very key defects. Defects with brakes, broken windscreens, faulty steering wheels, electrical problems, seats that are broken. And they also reported things like a complete lack of seat belts for passengers. 28% said they drove newer vehicles which did have seat belts for passengers, but the vast majority did not. So passengers can become a flying projectile in a relatively minor crash and can actually injure the driver and other passengers very badly. So those three factors were really key in the findings of my research.
So am I right to say then, Doctor, that when they do present at your facility having been in a crash, many of them will arrive exhausted, and exhaustion is likely one of the causes why there'd been a crash in the first place?
It could be. One of the drivers I assessed had been hit by a private vehicle from the left side. That private vehicle had actually capsized his vehicle, and he lost his entire right arm. He had a traumatic amputation as a result. So the drivers are not always the cause of the crashes in which they're involved, and I must just stress that. But yes, they are likely to be fatigued, and fatigue worldwide is recognized as a massive crash risk, particularly amongst those who are driving passengers around. So bear in mind, for the viewers, the next time you see a driver, a taxi driver in the traffic, he may be on hour 13, 14, or 15 of his shift and unreasonably fatigued in relation to the driving demands that he is facing.
And in terms of solutions, how do we address this? I mean, you've mentioned so many factors. I've picked up an issue of adequate pay, employment rights, such as the right to a day off. There's an issue of drivers being put in unsafe vehicles, essentially, because they're old. That then, to me, speaks to a lack of compliance monitoring by the authorities that are supposed to check that the cars are roadworthy and within the allowed, shall we say, age range.
Yes, I think there's three key government departments that need to come to the table here. Department of Employment and Labour is critically important. They are not inspecting the work conditions of taxi drivers, and they could be. The drivers are not really regulated or registered as employees for the most part. However, the associations are available, and inspectors could go and take a look at whether job contracts are in place, and they could go to ranks and they could actually check on what is happening on the ground. So Department of Labour or Employment and Labour is critically important in terms of enforcing what is actually a fairly sound sectoral determination, but it's been in place 15 plus years, and it is clearly not one that is being widely complied with. Secondly, the Department of Transport, as you say, they have a role to play in terms of vehicle roadworthiness, operating permits, and all of those sorts of factors. And there is bribery, there is fraud, there is corruption, and there's just general inefficiency within those systems. So they need to shake up the industry a little bit from that point of view. And then thirdly, the Department of Health is the passive recipient of the crash victims, the survivors. So Department of Health actually needs to recognize that it's an ethical public health crisis that is happening on our roads, given that the majority of South Africans who require motorized transport are traveling via the minibus taxi industry.
And Doctor, just a final one. In your interactions with the drivers, were you able to gauge whether they are optimistic about the chances of change, or if many of them have simply accepted that this is the reality of the industry and they're condemned to it until something else comes up outside of the taxi business?
Well, I think there is a degree of helplessness, and it's very linked to the high rate of unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, where for many people, this is the only option. It's the only type of job that is available. Precarious as it is, unpleasant as it is worth something to them. So I think there's a great desire for improvement in the industry. And one of the themes that emerged from my interviews was government needs to put its eyes on the industry. Government needs to pay attention to the drivers and what they're going through, because this industry is critically important to all of us in South Africa. May I touch very briefly on the issue of COVID?
Please do, Doctor, in 30 seconds if you can.
Okay, so this infectious disease transmission is another huge risk facing taxi drivers, and I think we need to bear in mind that in the COVID pandemic, they have been frontline workers right through the hardest lockdowns when buses and trains stopped running. They remain frontline workers. The transmission risks are extremely high. More than 5 passengers in an unventilated taxi, if one of them is COVID positive, it could take 20 minutes or less before other people are infected, and the drivers are as at risk as passengers. So masking, ventilation, clean air as much as clean hands is critically important as more and more people start moving around during this festive season in minibus taxis.
Dr. Lee, so good to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time tonight. That was Wits School of Public Health's occupational therapist and bioethicist, Dr. Lee Randall, speaking to us about the work conditions of taxi drivers in this country and how many of them come to find themselves in road crashes.